overwhelming number of studies prove plant-based eating is key to addressing the epidemic of preventable diseases associated with excessive meat consumption. Plant-based eating happens to also reduce environmental impact. But in India, where vegetarianism is quite widespread, dare say a civilizational legacy, and even here in America amongst certain activist circles, the very mention of vegetarianism as a positive practice spurs knee-jerk responses. The left launches into choice epithets, vegetarian elites, Hindu hardliners, misogynists, even castists, to conjure up a sordid tale of meat-eater oppression. The name-calling in headlines often suggests that Hindus and Jains would rather save cows and starve their children. On the right, there's a different kind of virtue signaling. Without regard to the economic impacts or cultural hegemony government impositions outlying an entire industry overnight may bring. The ill-conceived, hurt religious sentiment invocation only creates backlash and black markets. Only in India, then, are we treated to the horrid specter of beef-eating parties as a perverse declaration of religious freedom, caste liberation, and secular credentials. So I'm here today with our education director, Dr. Vijay Satnarine, to talk about vegetarianism and the dharmas and why it's so darn politicized. Welcome, Vijay.
Thank you, Suhag.
So let's just first start with the dharmas, and we don't need to restrict ourselves to the Hindu dharmas, but all the dharmas. What do they say about the vegetarian diet?
Such a lovely question and such a broad question. I think if we cycle away from the categories that we kind of are used to in the current discussions, and let's go right back to the foundations. There's a seminal teaching that teaches very simply, Jivo Jivasya Jivanam. Life subsists on life. Mm-hmm. And as organic beings ourselves, we need to consume organic matter in order to survive. And then each of the philosophical traditions, they take up the matter of, well, if we need to eat organic matter to survive, what should we eat? Depending on which tradition you belong to, there are discussions that will formulate some ethics that would have you on a plant-based diet. Some formulate ethics that have you on a diet that says, well, eat what you want, but when you're doing spiritual practices, keep loftier visions in mind. And then there are some philosophies that are not nonplussed, really. They're more interested in you actually doing some kind of spirituality, and whatever you eat is incidental. So there's a big spectrum. Having said that, because when someone undergoes spiritual practice, the diets tend to be the same. That diet is a plant-based diet for when somebody is doing spiritual practices. And if you choose to live by, a fully dharmically, ethically supported lifestyle in accordance with those Dharma traditions, then yes, plant-based diet is prescribed.
So just reading off some statistics here, because I think the stats do kind of indicate what you're saying from a historical vantage. So the Pew Research Center in 2021 conducted a major survey, and about 39% of Indian adults described themselves as vegetarian. And amongst those people who ate meat, they followed some sort of restriction on meat consumption, whether it was avoiding certain meats or not eating meat on certain days. Here's a breakdown of vegetarianism by religion, according to that survey. 92% of Jains, 59% of Sikhs, 44% of Hindus, 25% of Buddhists, 8% Muslim, 10% Christian. What's your kind of reaction to that?
Well, it debunks all of the stereotypes that we're seeing every day in the media, in our classrooms, when our children go to school over here. They get told that Indians and Hindus especially are all vegetarians. And so this very basic survey shows some really important data that I can't understand people would not be considering that data when they do talk about Hindus. Hindus are, therefore, overwhelmingly not vegetarian.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about how vegetarianism specifically gets politicized. And while in my introductory remarks, I talked a lot about India, we see a lot of this coming to fore here in the United States. Over the past several years, we've seen an uptick in activist-driven policymaking in attempts to add caste to non-discrimination policies. There was even a seminal report, and I use that word very lightly, that showed incidents of food preferences as somehow being indicators of casteist behavior. So and then even in some of these resolutions, it specifically mentions that eating habits are an indicator of caste. So how did vegetarianism become intertwined with caste identity and caste politics? Obviously, first starting in India, but now as it trickles over here.
It's such a wide-ranging question. It involves so many complex actors and things. But if you were to boil it down to some highlights, I think the milestones really start with the British trying to categorize everything. Mm-hmm. And in their categorizations, they did not know enough to draw parameters correctly or draw the contours in line with the people. Rather, they went with presuppositions. They presupposed, because they were in touch with the elite in Bengal, that every single person must look like exactly what was happening in those cities in Bengal, or in Punjab, as the case later went to be. In fact, and I want to say this really, really clearly, the class of people, and I think I should say this too, what people are referring to as caste really means clan or tribe. Mm-hmm. And if we're looking at what tribes do and how clans are, the way that they eat varies dependent on their worldviews and their histories and their regions and their locales. So we can't generalize to say that a caste eats in a certain way, because that's factually not true. And that's also borne out by the fact that even the class that people view as so, quote unquote, the highest, the scholarly class or the priestly class, there are a good number of traditions followed by those same priestly classes that do eat meat. And for example, Trikashevas, some types of Shaktas, they would consider any person that refuses to take the meal, to share in the meal that's offered after a celebration, they would view that as not only rude, but insulting. So to say that all spiritual people, or to say that even the spiritual teachers and the spiritual guides, the officiants, that they all eat vegetarian diets, and that high caste people are all vegetarians because of that, that's absolutely false.
Well, that leads me to my next question, and that is, what are some maybe regional or clan practices of vegetarianism or non-vegetarianism that really debunk this caste pyramid equation, with vegetarianism being more prolific towards the top of that pyramid? And then, of course, the implication is then, because it's a pyramid and a hierarchy, then that top of the pyramid are the meat oppressors oppressing those classes that do eat meat.
Right. I mean, just to start with, if we pick up Swami Vivekananda, if we pick up these people who are viewed by certain actors in the West, especially, and of course, Marxist scholars and the rest in India, they view, current Indian or Hindu nationalism or whatever label they give it as having started with or being really inflamed by Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was not a vegetarian. Mm-hmm. Swami Vivekananda, spiritual teacher, Ramakrishna Paramahansaji, he was also not a vegetarian. So right in there, their premise is flawed. And all we're getting is this narrative that's heaped on time and again. The pyramid that you mentioned, saying that everybody who is, high caste, they all don't eat meat, and that everybody who is low caste, they're the people who are eating meat. And so people who are viewed as backwards and uncivilized, only those people would eat meat. Where does that come from? Abhinavagupta, who is one of the greatest teachers that Shakta and Shaiva Dharma has had, was from Kashmir in the 900s, 1000s. He advocated that people should be thoughtful about what they eat, but in terms of banning, meat eating altogether, absolutely not. That's not part of his traditions. Moreover, and I want to be really careful how I say this, beef is eaten in regions in India historically, and those regions, even when Ashoka's blanket bans were tried to be enforced across the country, those bans could never get into those regions because those people were faithful, those people were spiritual, they practiced their spiritualities, and they did eat beef. So trying to put a blanket ban or trying to say that there's this one blanket way that all Hindus must behave, whether that comes from external actors or our own community members, it doesn't map with what we know in history.
So what are the implications when Hindu identity is equated with vegetarianism?
There's so much. It plays into the whole purity impurity paradigm that they've developed. And, the contention, of course, being that caste is about purity and impurity. We talk about amalatva, or the stainlessness, the fact that we are trying to cultivate an internal, mindset, our intellect that is freed from the stains of bias, of jealousy, of manipulativeness. All of those things we consider as stains. And when we're talking about purity, we're talking about amalatva, being without those kinds of dirty thoughts. They've taken it to mean purity, about you can't touch this, you can't touch that. And we must say that there were some traditions that really went overboard on that. And yet we have traditions that have absolutely the opposite take, because their contention is, if the entire multiverse is a transformation of Brahman, then everything from what is considered dirty all the way to what is considered pure, they're all the same. Right? And there are those traditions that double down on that, and they say, well, we craft our ethics on the basis of this. And if you go back in history, you can see the precursors to the Aghoris that are there today, the Kapalikas, the Kalamukas, those people. And also some specific types of Shakta Dharma, they say that it is more challenging to see the divine in things that look and appear to us as dirty or off-putting.
Right.
And so they advise their followers to pursue those things. Yes, they might be fringe, but they do exist. And before the colonial effects on ancient India, they would have been a lot more in vogue. So the skewed kind of take that people have creates not only a false sense of history, it's anachronistic, it's revisionist. It also shames people in a way. It's used as a slur because, these Hindus are so backwards and tight that they don't know. They're just following vegetarianism because of a religion without any kind of understanding that's very backward and superstitious. And, the elevated people over here, we're supposed to be all embracing. That narrative needs to get re-looked at, I think.
Well, I'm going to shift a little bit here in that, in terms of vegetarianism as a spiritual practice, we do see messages of following a vegetarian diet for those individuals who are committed in that way. What's the basis for that? Is it something beyond the recognition of maybe higher forms of life in animals, or is there something else at play?
So many answers to that question. If I was to talk from the basis of the Smarta tradition, so, going by the Sanskrit sources, there is a point in time where they recognize that actually consuming animals should be done in reverence of the fact that they too hold life. Mm-hmm. And so around the time of the Mahabharata, we first get to see these discussions really start to take place in the Mahabharata, where they are questioning whether we do need to be feeding people after yajna, after one of the Vedic ceremonies. Do we need to be feeding them meat, or do we try to feed everybody using plant-based things? And that discussion takes place. And the basis of that discussion, if you follow it, is about the ethics of confining animals from their natural habitats, the squalor that they're in. There's also a discussion around the fact that when you kill a parent animal, their child will cry for days on end, or vice versa. And that entire discussion on ethics and values takes place in the Mahabharata way before the Common Era. Mm. You can see in the Bhagavata, it's repeated again in the discussion, in the story of Prachina Barhi. And you can see that throughout the Smarta kind of sources that are examined, that there is an acceptance that not only because each living being is possessing Atma, the essence of life, but that there is also suffering that we are causing to those forms of life. That if we are trying to get to a place where we're reducing the amount of suffering we cause on Earth, individually, that's our highest principle, to leave the lightest footprint on this planet as we can, as we pursue our happiness and as we pursue everything else, to leave a light footprint. And the ethical quandary is something that does take them up. It's also something that's reflected in Vaishnava traditions. Shaivas and Shaktas are a lot more nuanced about this. Mm-hmm. And they are very, very understanding of the fact that it's part and parcel of people's cuisines. It's something that people have grown to love. And so they will tell people, just to show that you have a control on your mind and that you're not ruled by what your tongue wants all the time, but your brain can actually say, okay, I'm going to go on a detox for a bit. For those spiritual practices, they too will adopt a vegetarian diet. So the ethical reasons for vegetarian, or let's say plant-based diets, that's what we focus on in the Hindu Dharma traditions across the board. It's the ethical principles. It's not a commandment that you must be vegetarian or you have to not touch these things because they're unclean. That does not exist in our traditions. Absolutely not. To suggest so means that people have not been able to either read, study, or even observe how people are as Hindus.
I will ask two more questions and then we'll be done. And this might be out of your wheelhouse. In terms of meat and Ayurveda, how does that play into all of this?
Depends on which school of Ayurveda you follow. And there are some Ayurvedic teachers.
That's always the answer, isn't it? Depends.
It depends. I love the answer depends because it really gives us the understanding that we were end user focused. Mm-hmm. We were focused on, and we should still be focused on, not creating followers and cookie cutter replicas of whatever we think is the ideal. We should be dealing with people where they are and trying to provide them solutions that work for their lives and their situations, their context. That is the reason for all of this. That is a diverse set of answers I could give you. And so even in Ayurveda, though there are certain principles about the fact that consuming meat also means that you're consuming, foods from tamasic sources. Tamasic are those things that encourage lethargy and those kinds of qualities in a person. They're also rajasic because an animal, when they're being slaughtered, they have all those hormones. Hormones we know are chemical, and so when we consume them, and they're however the proteins, etc., and the chemicals are absorbed by the body goes, the Ayurveda at the very least suggests that those things too will have an effect on our psyche, on how we behave as humans, on how clear our thought is, and so Ayurveda also, on the majority of Ayurvedic sources, they do say, be careful about what you eat, mm-hmm. especially if you're in a certain type of sickness or going through something. They would advise the diet to change.
And my last question.
Sure.
Because we have talked about the diversity within Hindu communities and Dharmic communities broadly. So how might we navigate conversations about food culture and history in both an inquisitive and inclusive manner?
Such an important question. I wish more people would ask those questions. because once we start to look for the answer of those questions, I love the fact that we're part of a seeking tradition. We're advised to seek the answers. When we do start seeking the answers, we don't just look at one source or another source. We look through the variety of sources to try and understand what this world is all about. And when we do that, we start to see that the questions kind of gravitate towards two categories. What are your ethics and values? What is possible for you as a human being, knowing that you have a whole heap of likes and dislikes and ability to change and, desire to stay as you are. All of those things play into this. Chief of those things, especially if you're practicing, if you're practicing a specific Hindu Dharma tradition, you would also want to see how you can align your life with the ethical principles that they encourage you to take up. And when they're encouraging you to take it up, it's not that they're forcing you. Mm-hmm. They're asking you to consider things and see if you tried it out for 41 days, and this is usually how many people change their diets. Their spiritual teachers would say, okay, for 41 days, or for Chaturmasya, for the 4 months of the rainy seasons, or for whatever observance it is, take some time, see if you can see what changes this has on your life. Note your emotions, how they change, your reactions to people, how they change. Note any spiritual, insight you're able to get. And then see if that's something you want to make part of yours. Blanket banning things and blanket saying things as if Hindus are all one type of people, not only mischaracterization, but it's also a misinterpretation of our teachings. I want to be careful about this because we do venerate and have a lot of respect for animal life in our tradition, in a lot of our traditions, and especially in the tradition I practice. We would not even harm a fly, let alone a cow or an elephant or a horse or whatever. Right. So, especially when there are discussions around beef and beef eating, it was politicized in the 1800s and 1900s especially. And I want us to really try to navigate this in light of how our traditions talk about it. Mm. In each source you pick it up, they might say, oh, as someone who does that, they don't know what they're doing. They're inviting a ton of suffering. And then in a couple of sources down, you might say, well, in this episode in history, this person did this thing. And they might be, at odds with each other. That shows that they're trying to ask us to think for ourselves, right, not to download somebody else's opinion.
So maybe we might have to have an episode on Hindu gurus coming up with the elimination diet, because it almost sounds like that's what they were recommending to their disciples. Well, right. Thank you so much for this conversation, Vijay, and I hope to have more.
Thank you, Suhag.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.